The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and Maggie Redmond read it 3 times before she allowed herself to believe that it was real. She was sitting at the narrow desk in her rented room above the general store in Abilene, Kansas, with the morning light coming thin and pale through the single window. And the letter was written in a hand that was clearly unpracticed, large, blocky letters pressed hard into the paper, as though the writer had been fighting the pen rather than guiding it. It said, in plain and somewhat blunt terms, that a rancher by the name of Abel Hale, out on the Copper Creek spread 20 miles south of the town of Harlow, Texas, was in need of a schoolteacher. Not for a proper schoolhouse, because there was no proper schoolhouse within riding distance, but for his 2 sons, who were 7 and 9 years old and who had not had any formal schooling since their mother passed away 2 winters prior. The pay was $11 a month, room and board included, and the position was available immediately. Maggie folded the letter carefully and pressed her palms flat against the desk and thought about her life as it currently stood. She was 26 years old. She had been teaching in Abilene for 3 years at a schoolhouse that smelled of chalk dust and damp wood, and she was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of teacher children remembered and parents respected. But the school board had recently decided that a married woman would better suit the position, and since Maggie was decidedly unmarried, she had been given until the end of the month to clear out her desk. She had no family left in Kansas. Her mother had died when she was 16, her father the following year, and she had put herself through 2 years of teacher's training in Topeka on sheer determination, and a loan she had spent 5 years repaying. She had saved a little money, but not enough to last the winter if she did not find work. The letter, then, was not just an opportunity. It was a lifeline. She wrote back that same afternoon accepting the position, and within the week she had packed her 2 good dresses, her collection of primers and readers, her mother's silver hairbrush, and her own stubborn heart into a single trunk, and boarded the southbound train toward Texas. The town of Harlow was small enough that it barely warranted the name. It had a saloon, a post office, a livery stable, a dry goods store, and a church that doubled as a meeting hall on days when the pastor was occupied with other concerns. The people who lived there were sun-worn and practical, the kind of people who did not waste words because words did not feed cattle or mend fences. When Maggie stepped off the stage from the nearest rail stop with her trunk and her composure intact, she was met by a boy of about 9 who was standing beside a wagon with his arms crossed and his jaw set, looking very much as though he had been sent against his will. "You the teacher," he said. "I am," Maggie said. "I am Maggie Redmond. And you are?" "Eli Hale," the boy said. He did not extend his hand. He looked her over with the frank assessment of a child who had learned early to take the measure of strangers. "You don't look like much." Maggie set her trunk down and regarded him with equal frankness. "And you don't look like a boy who's had much schooling, so I suppose we are both in need of something today." The boy blinked. Then, very slightly, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was close, and Maggie decided it was enough to work with. He helped her load the trunk without being asked again, and they rode out from Harlow in the wagon, with the afternoon sun burning copper across the flat Texas land, through scrub brush and mesquite, and past dry creek beds that told of seasons when the rain had been generous and seasons when it had not. Eli did not speak much on the ride, but he answered Maggie's questions in short, clipped sentences that nonetheless told her a great deal. Yes, there was a younger brother named Thomas who was 7. No, their father did not come into town often. Yes, the ranch was big. No, he did not know how many acres. Yes, their mother had been dead for 2 years. He said this last part the way he said everything else, flat and factual. But Maggie noticed the way his hands tightened briefly on the reins before he loosened them again, and she filed that away. The Copper Creek Ranch came into view just as the sun was beginning its long, slow descent toward the horizon, and Maggie was struck immediately by the scale of it. The main house was not grand in the way of wealthy Eastern homes, but it was substantial, 2 stories of rough-hewn timber with a wide porch running along the front, and a stone chimney at either end. There were barns and outbuildings scattered with practical purpose across the yard, and the distant sound of cattle carried on the wind. It was a working place, a living thing, and it bore the marks of a man who understood land and labor. Abel Hale was standing on the porch when the wagon pulled up, and Maggie's first impression of him was that he was large in the way that working men are large, broad through the shoulders, thick through the chest, built by years of physical effort rather than any particular intention. He was perhaps 34 or 35, with dark hair going a little at the temples and a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from the same stone as the chimney. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hat was pushed back in the way of a man who had been working and had not yet decided whether the day was done. He came down the porch steps and held out his hand, and Maggie shook it with the firm grip her father had taught her. "Miss Redmond," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who thought before he spoke. "I'm Abel Hale. I appreciate you making the trip." "I appreciate the position, Mr. Hale," Maggie said. He looked at her with eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green, like the color the sky went before a storm, and his assessment was much like his son's, direct and thorough. But where Eli's gaze had been the frank curiosity of a child, Abel's was something more careful, measured. The look of a man who had learned to be cautious about letting new things into his life. "You come well recommended," he said. "The school board in Abilene wrote you a fine letter." "I hope to earn that recommendation," Maggie said. He nodded once, as though that settled something, and called for the ranch hand named Dewey to help with the trunk. The younger boy, Thomas, appeared from around the side of the house with a smear of dirt across his cheek and something small and likely alive cupped in both hands, which he presented to Maggie with enormous solemnity. "It's a horned toad," Thomas announced. "His name is General Grant." "He is very distinguished," Maggie said, leaning forward to examine the creature with genuine interest. "Does General Grant have any particular duties on the ranch?" Thomas considered this seriously. "He eats bugs," he said, "so mostly he just protects us from bugs." "A vital service," Maggie agreed, and Thomas beamed at her with the full and uncomplicated delight of a 7-year-old who had found someone willing to take his toad seriously. Maggie settled into the small room off the main parlor that Abel had prepared for her. It was clean and spare, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out toward the western pastures. Someone had placed a small bunch of wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill, and when she asked Dewey about it later, the old ranch hand grinned and said that Thomas had picked them himself that morning and made Abel put them there. Her first weeks at the Copper Creek Ranch established a rhythm that was both comfortable and quietly demanding. Every morning after breakfast, she conducted lessons in the main parlor, which Abel had cleared of the clutter of ranch ledgers and land maps to make space for a proper table and chairs. She had brought her primers and her readers and her copy of McGuffey's Eclectic, and she had also brought her own particular philosophy of education, which held that children learned best when the learning was connected to the life they were actually living. So she taught Eli his multiplication tables through the calculation of board feet for fence repairs, and she taught Thomas his letters through the names of the cattle and the ranch buildings and the tools hanging in the barn. She read to them both from history and from literature and from the careful, wondering prose of natural scientists, and she took them outside on clear mornings to practice their observation. What plants grew near water, what tracks meant which animal, how to read the color of the clouds. Eli remained cautious with her for the first 2 weeks, giving her the same small, testing resistances that bright children always give to new teachers claiming not to understand something he clearly understood, pretending to have lost work he had simply not done. Maggie met each of these with patience and a quiet consistency that eventually, inevitably, wore him down. The turning point came on a Wednesday morning when she found him reading ahead in the reader she had assigned, deeply absorbed in a story he was not supposed to reach for another 3 days. She sat down across from him and said nothing, only watched him, and when he finally looked up and realized he had been caught, he braced for the correction. "What do you think of the way the author uses the storm as a warning?" Maggie asked. Eli looked at her for a long moment. "I think he's being obvious about it," he said. "The reader can figure it out without the storm." "You're right," Maggie said. "What would you have done differently?" And just like that, the guardedness fell away, and she saw the child underneath, sharp and hungry, and badly in need of someone to take his mind seriously. As for Thomas, he had never been guarded at all. He loved Maggie with the wholehearted immediacy of a 7-year-old who had been without a woman's gentle presence for 2 years, and while she was careful not to overstep or to try to replace what he had lost, she let him love her in the uncomplicated way he needed to, and she loved him back in the steady, quiet way that a good teacher loves the children in her care. Abel Hale, meanwhile, was a more complicated matter. He was present at breakfast and supper every day without fail, because he was the kind of man who believed that whatever else the day demanded, the family sat down together at the table. He asked his sons about their lessons, and listened to their answers with a concentration that Maggie found striking. Most fathers in her experience treated their children's schooling as background noise, something the women handled, but Abel listened as though it mattered to him, nodding slowly at Eli's analysis of a historical event or Thomas's excited report of having learned a new word. He asked Maggie questions about their progress, careful and specific questions that showed he had been paying attention to what the boys told him. But he did not talk about himself. He answered direct questions with brief, polite answers, and then redirected the conversation to the boys or the ranch, or the weather or anything else that was not himself. He was courteous without being warm, attentive without being open, and there was about him the quality of a house where the shutters were kept drawn, not dark or hostile, just private, deeply and deliberately private. Maggie had always been curious about private people. She found them more interesting than open ones. She began to notice small things. That he came to the barn at first light every morning, even before the ranch hands were up, and spent an hour with the horses alone. That he kept a single book on the table beside his chair in the parlor. She noticed that it changed every few weeks, so he was reading, quietly and consistently, and that the books were not agricultural manuals but novels and histories, and once, memorably, a collection of essays by Emerson. That he had built a small wooden rocking horse for Thomas with his own hands, because she saw the wood shavings on his workbench and the care with which it had been sanded smooth. That when he thought no one was watching, he sometimes stood at the kitchen window in the evening and looked out toward the darkening pastures with an expression that was not quite sorrow and not quite emptiness but something between the two, something that had been there for a long time. She learned about his wife from Dewey, the old ranch hand who had been with Abel since before the boys were born, and who was not possessed of Abel's particular gift for keeping his own counsel. Her name had been Clara. She had been a lively woman, spirited and musical and deeply loved by everyone on the ranch, and she had died of a fever in the winter of 1880, just after Thomas's 5th birthday. Abel had taken it hard in the way that some men take grief, turning it inward, compressing it, letting it calcify into a kind of controlled distance from the world. He had kept the ranch going, raised his sons, done everything that needed doing, but he had closed the door on the parts of himself that were tender, and he had not opened it since. "He needs someone," Dewey told Maggie one afternoon when they were sitting on the porch shelling dried beans, in the easy companionship of two people who are too old and too practical to be bothered with pretense. "The boys need someone, but that man is as stubborn as any mule I ever worked with, and twice as proud." "He's not proud," Maggie said, turning a pod over in her fingers. "He's afraid." Dewey looked at her for a moment. "Well," he said, "I suppose that's the same thing sometimes." The event that first cracked Abel's careful composure open, at least a little, happened about 6 weeks into Maggie's time at the ranch. It was a Sunday, the one day Maggie did not conduct formal lessons, and she had taken the boys down to Copper Creek itself, a narrow, clear-running stream about a quarter-mile from the main house, to do what she called a nature study, which mostly meant walking along the bank and turning over rocks and talking about whatever they found. Thomas had General Grant in his shirt pocket. Eli had brought a notebook and was recording observations with the focused seriousness of a boy who had recently discovered that writing things down was a form of power. The trouble started when Thomas, reaching for something at the water's edge, slipped on a mossy stone and went into the creek with a splash and a yelp. The creek was shallow, and he was never in any real danger, but he came up sputtering and terrified and soaking wet, and began to cry with the full-throated anguish of a 7-year-old who has been scared into the realization of his own smallness. Maggie waded in without hesitation, gathered him up, carried him to the bank, and held him firmly against her chest while he sobbed and shook. She talked to him in a low, steady voice, the kind that does not try to stop the crying but sits with it, and she kept her arms around him until the shaking slowed and the sobs became hiccups and then, eventually, quieted. Then she peeled off his wet shirt and her own outer shawl and wrapped him in it, and they walked back to the ranch with Thomas tucked under her arm, still hiccuping but no longer afraid. Abel was crossing the yard when they came into sight, and she saw the moment he registered the scene: his soaking son, Maggie's damp dress, Eli's worried face, and the way the careful, controlled expression he habitually wore cracked open just enough to show the raw thing underneath. He covered the distance between them in several long strides and knelt down in the dirt in front of Thomas without any concern for his knees or his dignity, and he checked the boy over with his large hand's head, arms, legs, the hands of a man who needed to know for himself that his child was whole. "What happened?" he said, and his voice was different from the voice he used at the supper table. "Stripped down, unguarded. I fell in," Thomas reported, "and General Grant got wet too, but Eli says toads can swim, so he's probably fine." Abel looked up from his inspection of Thomas and found Maggie's eyes. Something passed between them in that moment, not words, not even a full thought, just a recognition, the way two people sometimes see each other clearly for the first time without quite meaning to. "Thank you," Abel said. Just those 2 words, but he said them in a way that meant considerably more. He was never in any real danger, Maggie said, but he was frightened and he needed a moment. Abel nodded. He stood and then, with the slightly awkward formality of a man performing an unaccustomed gesture, he said, "Would you like me to have Dewey heat water for a bath? Your dress is wet." "That's very kind," Maggie said. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." She went inside. He stood in the yard for a moment after she was gone, and she did not see him standing there, but Dewey did, and Dewey said nothing, because he was a wise old man who understood the value of letting things unfold at their own pace. After that day, something shifted in the way Abel moved around the ranch house. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would have pointed to directly, but Maggie was observant, and she noticed. He began to linger a little longer at the supper table, contributing to the conversation rather than simply presiding over it. He asked her questions that were not strictly about the boys, what she thought of the dry spring, whether she had read a particular book, what she made of the cattle situation out west. He listened to her answers with that same focused attention he gave everything, and sometimes he disagreed with her, quietly and directly, and she found that she enjoyed disagreeing with him far more than she had expected. There was an evening about 8 weeks in when they were both in the parlor after the boys had gone to bed. She with her own reading, he with his ledgers, and the oil lamp was burning low and golden between them, and the night sounds of the ranch were coming soft through the windows, and they talked. Not about anything of great consequence, or at least that was how it began. She asked about the ranch's history, how his father had built it, and he answered. And then he asked about her family, and she answered. And the conversation moved the way conversations move when two people have forgotten to be careful with each other. And an hour passed, and then another, and when the lamp finally burned down and the darkness pressed in, they both looked up and seemed surprised to find that the night had gotten so far along without their noticing. "I should let you get to bed," Abel said, and he said it with a kind of reluctance that he did not entirely manage to conceal. "Yes," Maggie agreed, and she closed her book and rose, and at the doorway of the parlor she paused and said, without quite planning to, "You're easier to talk to than I expected, Mr. Hale." He looked at her across the lamplight. "You're easier to talk to than I expected anyone to be," he said. She went to bed with that sitting warm in her chest, and she lay in the dark for a long time listening to the Texas night, the distant call of a nighthawk, the soft sound of wind through the mesquite, and she told herself firmly that she was here to teach his sons, and that whatever warmth had built up in the parlor tonight was simply the natural result of human beings sharing a comfortable space, and that she was a grown woman of 26 who had been through enough to know better than to read meaning into a man's careful words. She did not fully believe herself, but she told herself anyway. The following Saturday, Abel announced at breakfast that the ranch needed supplies from town, and that if Miss Redmond had any need of provisions, she was welcome to come along. Eli immediately announced that he also needed to come along, because he wanted to see whether the dry goods store had received a new shipment of illustrated newspapers. Thomas announced that he too was coming, and that General Grant deserved an outing. The ride into Harlow was therefore a family affair, the five of them counting Dewey, who was driving bumping along the road in the wagon with Thomas narrating everything they passed, and Eli reading one of Maggie's primers and occasionally reading passages aloud when he found something he wanted to argue about, which was frequently, because he had inherited his father's tendency toward direct opinion. In town, while Abel conducted his business at the dry goods store and Dewey managed the wagon, Maggie took the boys to the post office to check for her own correspondence. There was a letter there that gave her a moment's pause, a note from a former colleague in Abilene describing a teaching position that had opened at a proper school in Dodge City, a larger school with a higher salary and better prospects. The school board there, apparently, did not share Abilene's prejudice against unmarried teachers. She tucked the letter into her pocket and said nothing to anyone, but she thought about it on the ride home, watching the Texas land roll by under the wide blue sky, and she was surprised by how little appeal the Dodge City prospect actually held for her. 8 weeks ago it would have seemed like exactly the right thing. Now it sat in her pocket like a small, unwanted weight. The trouble with the Delaney boys happened the following week, and it was the kind of trouble that the Wild West produced with a wearying reliability, small and local, and fueled by the combination of boredom, pride, and the particular cruelty that some children develop when they have not been taught any better. The Delaney family had a spread about 5 miles to the east, and their oldest boy, a big, mean-spirited 14-year-old named Burl, had taken to riding past the creek path that Eli used when he went to check the cattle for his father. Eli was 9, wiry and quick, with his father's jaw and his mother's spirit, and Burl had made it a habit to call after him things designed to sting, about his mother being dead, about his father being too rough-handed and too poor to keep good cattle, about the schoolteacher his father had hired being an old maid who couldn't find a husband. Eli did not tell his father because Eli was 9 and proud, but he told Thomas, and Thomas told Maggie with the transparent urgency of a 7-year-old who does not know how to not tell things, especially things that are troubling him. Maggie thought about it for a day, and then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She rode over to the Delaney spread alone on a borrowed horse. She was a competent rider, her father had seen to that, and she asked to speak with Mrs. Delaney, and she had a quiet, civil, very pointed conversation with that woman about the kind of man young Burl was being shaped into, and what the consequences of that kind of shaping tended to look like 20 years down the road. Mrs. Delaney, who was a tired woman with more children than she could easily manage and a husband who was frequently absent, listened to all of this with an expression that moved from defensiveness to something rower and more honest. She promised to speak with Burl. Burl did not bother Eli again. When Abel found out through Dewey, who had found out from the hand who had saddled the horse for Maggie, he came to her after supper with an expression that she could not quite read. He stood in the doorway of her room while she was preparing the next day's lessons, turning his hat in his hands the way he always did when he was working out how to say something. "You rode out to the Delaney place," he said. "I did," Maggie said, and put down her pencil and looked at him directly. "Alone?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I could have handled that," he said. "I know you could have," Maggie said, "but you would have handled it differently." Men in this part of the country have a way of handling disagreements that tends to leave everyone angrier than they started. I thought a conversation might work better. Another silence. He was looking at her with that storm-gray gaze, and she could not tell whether he was annoyed or something else. "Did it?" he said. "He hasn't bothered Eli since," she said. Abel turned his hat once more in his hands. Then he said, "That was a brave thing to do." "It was not brave," Maggie said. "It was practical. Burl Delaney is 14 years old and mean because he has not been shown better. His mother is not a bad woman. She just needed someone to speak plainly to her." Abel looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before, not just the measured courtesy he showed her daily, but something open, something that recognized her. "Thank you," he said, "for looking out for my boy." "Both your boys are worth looking out for," Maggie said, and meant it with everything she had. He nodded, started to turn away, and then stopped. Without quite looking at her, he said, "You're nothing like I expected." "What did you expect?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. "Someone older," he said, "someone more worn down." "The day is young," Maggie said dryly, and he laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, the first real laugh she had heard from him. And then he caught himself as though the sound had surprised even him, and he shook his head once and said good night and went down the hall, and Maggie sat very still at her small desk for a long moment after he was gone. She was in serious trouble, and she knew it. She had been strict with herself about this for years, about the particular danger of caring for men whose circumstances made the caring impossible. She was the hired teacher. He was the employer. She was here for the boys, not for him. And there was Clara, who had been loved here, whose presence was still in the house in a dozen small ways, in the quilt on the parlor chair that someone kept folded just so, in the small portrait on the mantel, in the way Thomas still sometimes paused in doorways as though he was waiting for someone who was not coming. She could not ask a grieving man to make room for her, and she would not try. She resolved to be professional and warm and helpful, and to keep her own feelings in their proper place, which was firmly behind the practicalities of her situation. The resolution held for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, it rained. Not the dramatic thunderstorm of novels, but a long, steady, soaking autumn rain that turned the yard to mud and kept everyone inside, and made the ranch house feel smaller and more intimate than usual. Lessons went well in the morning. Thomas was working through long words with genuine determination, sounding out syllables with a concentration that made his tongue poke out between his teeth. And Eli had begun a composition about the history of the Kishom Trail that was, frankly, better than much of what Maggie had seen from students twice his age. She read it twice and told him so, and the pride on his face was something she would have liked to hold on to. In the afternoon, with the rain still falling and the boys engaged in their own pursuits, Thomas building an elaborate fort out of the spare saddle blankets and Eli writing a second composition without being asked, Maggie found herself in the kitchen. And Abel was there too, because the rain had stopped the outdoor work, and he had come inside to do the sort of account keeping that got pushed aside during busy days. They worked at opposite ends of the kitchen table in a comfortable silence that was better than most conversations Maggie had had in her life. The rain pressed against the windows. The stove threw its warmth across the room. After a while she made coffee and set a cup in front of him without asking, and he looked up with an expression of quiet surprise, as though he had not expected anyone to think of him. "Thank you," he said. They were quiet again. Then he said, without looking up from his ledger, "Do you miss Abilene?" "No," Maggie said, and was honest enough to add, "I did not think I would say that so soon, but no, not particularly." "What about before Abilene?" he said. She told him about her parents, about the farm they had kept in a part of Kansas that was flat and bleak and beautiful in the way that simple, enormous things are beautiful, about learning to read by the light of a tallow candle, about her father reading Shakespeare aloud on winter evenings with the particular dramatic flourish of a man who had never seen a play but had a gift for performance, about the loneliness after they were both gone, and the decision to train as a teacher, and the years of putting one foot in front of another, until she found something that felt, if not entirely like home, at least like purpose. Abel listened to all of this with the coffee cup in his hands and his eyes on her face, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Purpose is not a small thing." "No," she agreed. "It kept me going for a long time. What does it take the place of?" He said, and it was such a precisely targeted question that she caught her breath. She met his eyes. "A number of things," she said carefully. He looked down at his coffee. "Clara used to say that a person could fill their life with purpose and still go to bed empty," he said. He said it quietly, the way a man says something he has thought about for a long time but not said aloud. "She sounds like she was wise," Maggie said. "She was," Abel said. "She was." He stopped, and she watched the familiar process of his composure reasserting itself, the way a door closes not in anger but in habit. But this time, when he looked up, the door had not fully shut. "She would have liked you," he said. "She would have had strong opinions about you, and she would have shared every one of them, and she would have been right about most of it." Maggie did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and they sat together in the rain-softened afternoon with the warmth of the stove between them and something careful and new and fragile growing in the air, and neither of them did anything to break it. October came to the ranch with a blaze of gold across the mesquite and a sharpness in the morning air that made every breath feel purposeful. Maggie had been there for 3 months. The boys had made remarkable progress. Eli was reading well above his years and had developed a passion for history that made their lessons a daily argument in the best possible sense, two people working their way through ideas with full engagement. Thomas had mastered his letters and was working earnestly on his numbers, and he had also, under Maggie's careful encouragement, begun to write small stories about General Grant's adventures, which she corrected for spelling and grammar and read aloud at the supper table to enormous collective appreciation. Abel had taken to sitting in on the lessons sometimes, when the ranch work allowed. He never interrupted and rarely spoke during them, but she was aware of him in the chair near the window, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that his being there made her sharper, more engaged, more alive to the pleasure of a mind genuinely working. Eli noticed too, and she could see the boy processing this. His father's presence, its meaning, what to make of it. One afternoon, after a particularly lively lesson about the causes of the Civil War, in which Eli had produced an analysis of the economic underpinnings that was genuinely sophisticated, and Abel had listened from his corner with an expression Maggie could not name, Eli looked between his father and Maggie with the calculating look of a 9-year-old who is adding things up and said, quite directly, "Do you like each other?" There was a brief silence. "Your father is my employer," Maggie said carefully. "And I have a great deal of respect for him." "That's not what I asked," Eli said. "Eli," Abel said, in the tone that settled things. Eli shrugged with the magnificent unconcern of a child who has made his point and is content to let the adults manage the rest of it. That evening, while Maggie helped Thomas with his evening reading, a task that had become a comfortable ritual, Thomas curled against her side on the parlor settee with the book across both their laps. She looked up and found Abel in the doorway watching them, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on it. Not sad, exactly. Not happy. Something in between, something whole. He met her eyes and looked away, and she looked back down at the book, and Thomas said with perfect oblivious timing, "Maggie, do you think General Grant will ever find a friend?" "I think," Maggie said, "that he probably already has one. He just might not know it yet." The letter from Dodge City had been sitting in her drawer for over a month. She answered it on a cool Tuesday morning, thanking the school board for their consideration and declining the position. She sealed the envelope and took it to the post office herself the next time Abel rode into Harlow for supplies, and she felt, as she slid it through the slot, an uncomplicated sense of relief that told her everything she needed to know about the choice she had made, even if she was not yet ready to examine the reasons directly. The crisis, when it came from a direction she had not anticipated. A man named Garrett Cole arrived at the ranch on a Thursday in early November. He was a cattle buyer from San Antonio, well-dressed in the manner of men who do business at a distance from physical labor, and he arrived with 2 associates and an offer for Abel's herd that was substantially higher than the current market rate. He was also, Maggie noted at supper that evening, where Abel had invited him to eat, because hospitality was the rule of the land regardless of who was extending it, the kind of man who looked at her in a way she did not care for. Not hostile, but assessing in a way that reduced her to an element of the domestic arrangement rather than a person in it. Over supper, Cole made conversation that was pleasant on the surface and pointed underneath. He asked Abel about the ranch's history, about his plans, about the boys. He asked about Maggie in a way that positioned her as a curiosity, a woman alone out here, not a wife. What an interesting arrangement, and he said it all with a smile that suggested he found the interesting arrangement particularly interesting. "Miss Redmond is the boys' teacher," Abel said, and his tone was mild and completely final. "Of course," Cole said, and smiled at Maggie in a way that was not quite a smile. Maggie returned it with a composure she had spent years developing and ate her supper, and contributed to the conversation on the topics of cattle management, rail access, and the prospects for the upcoming winter with the quiet competence of a woman who knew what she knew, and was not diminished by a man's failure to recognize it. After supper, when Cole and his associates had retired to the rooms Abel had prepared in the bunkhouse, Maggie was clearing the supper dishes. She helped with this always. It was simply sensible, and Abel was at the kitchen table looking over the terms Cole had proposed, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that something was troubling him. "The offer is good," she said. "Too good," Abel said without looking up. "A man offering too good a price wants something else along with the cattle." "What do you think he wants?" Abel turned the papers over. "There's been talk of a rail spur through this part of Texas. If the rail comes through, the land between here and Harlow becomes very valuable. Cole might be less interested in my cattle than in establishing a relationship that gives him first access to that conversation." Maggie dried a dish and thought about this. "Then you have more leverage than he wants you to know about." Abel looked up. "Yes," he said. "Don't sell until you understand the whole picture," she said. "Send a letter to the land office in Austin. Get the actual information about the rail survey." He looked at her for a moment. "That's good counsel," he said. "My father was a practical man," she said. "He taught me that the most important thing you can do in any negotiation is know what you're actually selling." Abel was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she had not expected. "I have been fortunate," he said slowly, as though working out the words, "in the people who have come to this ranch." She understood that he meant her. She kept her eyes on the dish she was drying. "So have I," she said softly, "in the place I was sent." He did not say anything else, but when she looked up from the dish, he was not looking at the papers. He was looking at her, and the storm-gray eyes were very still, and she felt the moment with a clarity that was almost painful, the precise sensation of something that matters becoming more so. Garrett Cole left the following morning without a deal, though he left graciously enough, and Abel did write to Austin, and the response confirmed exactly what he had suspected about the rail survey. The Copper Creek Ranch sat on ground that was becoming considerably more valuable, and Abel handled the subsequent negotiations from a position of knowledge rather than courtesy, with a quiet effectiveness that Maggie heard about afterward from Dewey, who had been present and who described it with obvious admiration. "That man knows when to talk and when to be quiet," Dewey told her. "Wish I had a tenth of his patience." November settled into the ranch with cold mornings and clear afternoons, and the rhythm of life there had by now become as natural to Maggie as anything she had ever known. She knew the way the kitchen smelled before breakfast, the sound the old windmill made when the north wind picked up, the particular quality of the light in the late afternoons when the sun came through the parlor windows at a long, golden angle. She knew that Eli did his best thinking when he was moving, so she sometimes gave him problems to work through while they walked the pasture fence. She knew that Thomas needed 10 minutes of quiet after lunch, or the afternoon lessons would be a struggle. She knew that Abel took his coffee black and that he read for an hour before he slept, and that he was, beneath all the careful containment, a person of deep feeling who had simply never been given a place to set that feeling down. The evening it all changed began with snow. It was rare for that part of Texas, even in November, but the temperature had been dropping for 2 days, and the sky had gone the particular flat white that meant serious weather. And when the first flakes came down just after supper, they came fast, and within an hour the yard was covered and the temperature had fallen hard. Abel went out with the hands to make sure the cattle were secured and the barns were tight, and Maggie put the boys to bed with extra blankets and sat by the fire in the parlor with her mending, listening to the wind push against the shutters. He came back in from the cold 2 hours later, snow on his coat and his hat and his shoulders, and she was there in the parlor firelight, and she stood and said, "Sit down, I'll get you coffee." And she brought it and he sat and she sat across from him, and the fire was between them and the snow was outside, and the house was quiet with the deep quiet of children sleeping and a world gone still and white. "The cattle are fine," he said. "Dewey and the boys have the barn secure." "Good," she said. He drank the coffee. He looked at her across the firelight, and this time he did not look away, and she did not either, and the silence was not uncomfortable, but it was full of something, thick with it, the way the air gets before a storm of a different kind. "I have been wanting to say something to you for some time," Abel said. Her hands were still in her lap. "Then say it," she said. He set the coffee down carefully. He was a deliberate man, a man who did not do anything without having thought it through, and she could see him thinking now, choosing words with the precision of someone who means what he says. "When I put out that notice for a teacher," he said, "what I was thinking about was the boys. I was thinking that they needed more than I could give them on my own in the way of learning. I was thinking practically, the way I think about most things." He paused. "I was not thinking about what it would mean to have someone like you in this house." Maggie waited. "You have done more for Eli and Thomas than I know how to say properly," he said. "Eli is different from how he was, not just smarter, though he is. He's steadier, he laughs more. He's not carrying the same weight he was. His voice had changed, deeper and rougher. And Thomas has." He stopped again, and this time the pause was longer. "Thomas has been motherless for 2 years, and watching you with him has been." He shook his head once, and she saw with a start that his jaw was tight with the effort of keeping something controlled. "You have been very good to my boys," he said. "You have been good to me." "You have been good to me as well," Maggie said quietly. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "I have spent 2 years telling myself that I am done with the kind of feeling that makes a man vulnerable. That I had it once, and I am grateful for what I had, and I do not need to look for it again." He met her eyes. "I have been wrong about that. I have spent 3 months being proved wrong about it, and I think I need to tell you because you deserve honesty and because keeping it to myself is not." He pressed his mouth together. "It is not something I am able to keep doing." Maggie felt something open in her chest, wide and warm and terrifying. "Abel," she said, and his name felt different in her mouth than Mr. Hale ever had. "I know you are here for the boys," he said. "I know this is your work and your livelihood, and that I have no right to ask you to see it as anything more than that. But I would rather say this and have you tell me plainly that it changes nothing, than say nothing and spend the rest of the winter sitting across a supper table from you and wondering whether I was a coward." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the fire and the snow and her own heartbeat. Then she said, "I declined a teaching position in Dodge City 6 weeks ago." He looked at her. "When?" "October, the week after the rain." She watched his face. "I told myself it was because the Copper Creek position suited me. The boys were making progress, and it seemed wrong to leave in the middle of things." She held his gaze. "But I am 26 years old, and I have been practical long enough to recognize when I am lying to myself." Abel Hale looked at her across the firelight, and the controlled, careful thing in his face gave way completely, the way a dam gives way not all at once but in a slow, inevitable opening that, once it starts, cannot be stopped. "Maggie," he said, and her name in his mouth was something else entirely. He crossed the room with the directness of a man who has made up his mind, and he sat beside her on the settee, and he took her hand, both her hands, actually, cupped in his large, rough ones, and he held them with a gentleness that she would not have expected from hands that size, and he said, "I would like to court you properly, if you are willing." She looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face, open and uncertain and more honest than she had ever seen it. "I am willing," she said, "very much so." He did not kiss her that night. He was, as she had observed, a deliberate man, and he sat with her beside the fire with her hands in his, and they talked for another hour, quiet and unhurried, while the snow fell outside, and the house held them in its warmth. And it was better than most kisses she had known, the particular sweetness of a beginning that both people are fully present for. The courtship of Maggie Redmond and Abel Hale was conducted with a kind of careful, mutual seriousness that suited them both. There were evening walks on the clear, cold days, around the pasture fence, with the horses watching from behind the rails, and their breath making soft clouds in the cold air. There were evenings in the parlor after the boys slept, sometimes talking, sometimes reading in the same comfortable silence they had always shared, but with a different quality to it now, openly acknowledged rather than carefully unnamed. He brought her wildflowers when he found them, the way Thomas had done on her first day, and the echo of that first gesture made her smile every time. He told her about Clara. Not all at once and not easily, but honestly over several evenings, the way a man opens something that has been shut for a long time carefully, testing each hinge. He told her who Clara had been and how they had met, and what the early years of the ranch had been like with her brightness at the center of it, and he told her about the winter she died and what it had done to him. He told her because he believed she deserved to know, and because he needed her to understand that what he felt for her was not a replacement for what he had had, but something that had grown in its own right from its own ground, something that was entirely itself. Maggie listened to all of it and held his hand through the harder parts and did not try to minimize what Clara had been, because she was not that kind of woman, and because she understood that loving someone properly means making room for all of who they are, including the griefs they carry. "You don't have to choose between loving her and being here," she told him one evening. He looked at her steadily. "How do you know things like that?" he said. "My mother was very wise," she said, "and I paid attention." The boys knew, of course, because children always know, and because Eli in particular was the kind of perceptive child who noticed everything and drew accurate conclusions. His response was characteristic. He said nothing directly for several days, and then came to Maggie while she was grading his composition one afternoon and said, with studied casualness, "If you and my father got married, would you still be my teacher?" "I would still teach you," Maggie said carefully. "Whether we got married or not, I would still be your teacher as long as you needed one." Eli considered this. "Thomas would be very upset if you left," he said. "I know," Maggie said. I would also be upset, Eli said, in the tone of a boy offering a significant concession. In case that matters. It matters a great deal, Maggie said. Thomas's response was less measured. On a Sunday afternoon in December, he climbed into Abel's lap while Abel was reading, wrapped his arms around his father's neck and said directly into his ear, "Maggie should stay forever." Abel, Maggie was told by Dewey, who had been witness to this, had held his son tightly for a long moment and said quietly, "I know, Thomas, I know." It was the week before Christmas when Abel proposed, in the straightforward, unadorned way that suited him. They had gone for an evening walk after supper. The cold had settled into something steady and clear, and the stars over the Texas plains were extraordinary, the kind of sky that makes a person feel small and expansive at the same time. They had been talking about something inconsequential, and then Abel stopped walking and Maggie stopped beside him, and he turned to face her with the same expression she had seen when he crossed the yard toward Thomas after the creek incident, stripped down, fully present. "I am not a man who finds talking easy," he said, "but I want to say this as clearly as I can because you deserve to have it said clearly." "Abel," she said. "I love you," he said. "I did not expect to say that to anyone again. I am grateful that I was wrong about that. I would like very much for you to be my wife, if you will have me. Not because the boys need a mother, they do, and I won't pretend otherwise, but because I need you. Because this ranch and this life are better for you being in them, and I do not want to go back to the way it was before you came." Maggie looked at him under the enormous Texas stars, this quiet, difficult, steadfast man who read Emerson in the evenings and built rocking horses by hand and had spent 2 years keeping his whole heart in reserve, and she felt something settle in her with the solidity of a foundation stone. "I love you too," she said. "Yes." He kissed her then, in the cold starlight, with the kind of care and deliberateness with which he did everything, and it was nothing like she had imagined and better than anything she had hoped for. They were married in the Harlow church on a Saturday in February 1883, with Dewey as witness and Eli standing very straight beside his father and Thomas weeping openly and unabashedly with General Grant in his shirt pocket, because Thomas felt things completely and saw no reason not to show it. The pastor was a practical man who performed the ceremony without excess ceremony, and afterward there was a small celebration at the dry goods store. The owner's wife had organized it with the efficiency of a woman who understood that community was built through exactly these occasions, with dried apple cake and strong coffee, and a fiddle player who did his best. Maggie wore the better of her 2 good dresses, the dark green wool that made her eyes look bright, and Abel had on his good coat and a clean shirt. And when the pastor pronounced them married, and Abel turned to look at her with those storm-gray eyes, and the beginning of a smile that was no longer a surprise to her, she thought that she had been given something she had not known she was looking for, and that the looking had been done by putting herself on a southbound stage and trusting that purpose would lead somewhere worthwhile. Life at the Copper Creek Ranch after the wedding settled into a new configuration that held all the old rhythms and added new ones. Maggie continued to teach the boys that had never been in question, and she expanded the lessons as the boys expanded. Eli, at 10, was beginning to work through material that a 12-year-old in a city school would have found challenging, and Maggie was already thinking about correspondence courses and eventually the possibility of a proper school in Harlow, which she had taken it upon herself to campaign for at every available opportunity with the town council. Thomas, at 8, had decided that he wanted to be a naturalist, which Maggie encouraged with complete sincerity, and his stories about General Grant had evolved into a genuine natural history journal that she bound for him in cardboard and twine. She and Abel developed the particular intimacy of 2 people who are well matched, not in the sense of being alike, because they were not very alike, but in the sense of each making the other more fully themselves. He drew her into the practical world of the ranch, showing her the cattle and the land and the decisions that kept it all working, and she found that she had opinions about all of it, which he listened to and sometimes adopted and sometimes argued with and always took seriously. She drew him out of the careful containment he had built around himself, not by dismantling it but by being someone he chose to open it for, and the man she found inside it was warmer and funnier and more surprising than the controlled exterior had suggested. He laughed more. She noticed that most of all. Not the short, startled laugh she had drawn from him that first time, but genuine, easy laughter, the kind that meant something had gotten through. In the autumn of 1883, Maggie told Abel that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the boys were up, at the kitchen table, with the coffee between them and the early light just coming through the window, and she watched his face go through several things in rapid succession: surprise, something that was not quite believing, and then something wide and wondering that she did not have a word for. He came around the table and he held her face in his hands and he kissed her forehead, and she felt his hands shaking slightly, and he said, "Are you well? Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Very well." "Good," he said, and held on. The boys, when told, had characteristically different reactions. Eli said, "Will it be smart?" which made Abel laugh. Thomas said, "Can I teach it things?" which made Maggie laugh. And Dewey, who was told by Abel that same afternoon while they were checking the fence line, took off his hat and pressed it to his chest and said, "Well, boss, it's about time this place got some new joy in it." It was a boy. He arrived in the spring of 1884, in the first warm weeks when the mesquite was flowering and the creek was running full, and Abel named him James, after his own father, and Maggie agreed to it because Abel said it with such quiet, steady feeling that there was nothing to disagree with. James arrived healthy and loud, and with a full head of dark hair like his father's, and he was placed in his father's arms first, and Abel stood with his newest son in the kitchen of the ranch house, while the morning light came through the windows, and said nothing for a long time, just looked down at this small new person with an expression that was all the things he did not normally say. The ranch, in the years that followed, continued to grow and change. The rail spur came through in 1885, exactly as Abel had suspected it would, and the Copper Creek Ranch's position made it a natural hub for the shipping of cattle to markets in Kansas City and beyond, and the income from this transformed the operation from a solid, working spread to something genuinely prosperous. Abel reinvested carefully, the way he did everything, expanding the herd and improving the infrastructure and paying his men well, which meant that the men who worked for him were loyal in a way that money alone does not buy. The Harlow School that Maggie had campaigned for opened in 1886. It was a modest building, single-roomed and well-built, and the school board, persuaded finally by a combination of Maggie's steady advocacy and the influx of families drawn by the rail economy, hired a young teacher from Austin named Miss Alvarez, and Maggie sat on the school board and helped shape the curriculum and felt a satisfaction in it that was specifically her own. Eli, by then 12, attended the school as much for the social experience as the academic one, since Maggie had by then taken his education to a level that required correspondence courses from a college in San Antonio that offered them. Thomas attended and loved it and organized the other children into a nature study group that met on Saturday mornings, which Miss Alvarez encouraged with the cheerful pragmatism of a good teacher who knows when to step back. General Grant, the horned toad, lived for 6 more years after Maggie's arrival at the ranch, which Dewey maintained was unprecedented and attributable entirely to the civilizing effect of good company. And when he finally passed peacefully in his box behind Thomas's bed, Thomas wrote a eulogy that Maggie considered, privately, one of the finest pieces of prose she had encountered in years of teaching, and she told him so without any softening, because he deserved to know it. James grew into a round-cheeked, cheerful child who had his mother's curiosity and his father's stubborn quietness, and who followed Abel around the ranch from the time he could walk with the total devotion of a youngest child who has found his hero. Abel, who had always been good with his sons, was with James something slightly different, softer in some way, more willing to be seen fully, as though the years and Maggie's presence had worn away enough of the stone that the warmth came through more easily. He got down on the floor with James when James needed to show him something. He told stories at bedtime, which Eli told Maggie with a mixture of embarrassment and pleasure was new. Their father had not done that when they were small. "He's different now," Eli said one afternoon. He was 14, thoughtful in the way of a boy standing at the edge of something larger, and he said it without complaint or resentment as an observation. "Is that good or bad?" Maggie asked. Eli thought about it seriously. "Good," he said. "He used to carry too much." She looked at her stepson, this sharp and loyal and growing boy, and felt a love for him that was not simple or uncomplicated but was entirely real. "He still carries a great deal," she said. "He just knows now that he doesn't have to carry it alone." Eli nodded slowly. "You taught him that," he said. "He let me," she said. "That's the harder part." In the spring of 1887, Maggie told Abel there was another baby coming. He was less surprised this time, but no less moved, and this time he came to her side of the table immediately, without the pause that had marked his first hearing of it, and held her with his arms around her shoulders and his cheek against her hair, and she felt the steadiness of him like a foundation. The second child was also a boy, small and fierce, with Maggie's brown eyes and Abel's jaw, and they named him William after Maggie's father, and Thomas, who was now 11, declared himself William's primary caretaker, and took this responsibility with a seriousness that made everyone on the ranch treat him with appropriate gravity. James, 3 years old, regarded the new baby with the deep suspicion of a child being displaced as the youngest, and communicated this through a period of particular loudness that tested everyone's patience and made Abel and Maggie laugh helplessly in the dark of their bedroom when the boys were finally asleep, because it was the kind of laughter that comes from loving the difficulty of a full life. The ranch hands, who had watched all of this unfold over 5 years, from the arrival of the schoolteacher with her trunk and her primers, through the courtship and the wedding and the children, through the growth of the operation and the prosperity of the land, had developed for Maggie a quiet, collective regard that expressed itself in small, practical ways. Fence fixed before she asked. Wood stacked by the kitchen door without being told. A general, unspoken agreement that the woman who had brought the boss back to himself was someone worth looking after. Dewey, who was getting older and slower but showed no intention of going anywhere, said to Abel one evening on the porch, both of them with their coffee, watching the last of the sunset go orange and gold over the western pastures, "I have worked for a good many men in my time. You are the best of them, but you are better now than you were before she came." Abel was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Most men don't," Dewey said. "I know that too," Abel said. Abel came to Maggie that night, the boys in their beds, William asleep, James finally worn out by his own loudness, the ranch quiet and still, and he found her at the desk in their room, writing a letter to the school board about expanding the Harlow School's resources, because she was always working on something, and he stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders and his chin near her ear and said, "Come to bed." "I'm almost finished," she said. "You're always almost finished," he said, with the warmth that was the private version of the contained public man. She put down the pen and turned and looked at him. He was 41 now, with more gray at his temples and lines at the corners of his eyes that were partly weather and partly the years, and she was 35, and they had been married for 4 years, and she thought he was the most beautiful man she had ever seen in her life, not because of anything that could be pointed to directly, but because of what he was, the full and complicated wholeness of him. "I love you," she said, for perhaps the 10,000th time, and it was not less than the first. "I love you," he said, and meant it with everything. There was a moment, a year after that, that Maggie thought about for the rest of her life as the one in which she understood what she had done, and what it had cost, and what it had given back, and found the balance not just acceptable but magnificent. It was a Sunday in October 1888, and the weather was the kind of perfection that Texas produced in the fall, clear and cool and golden, the kind of day that felt like a gift. Abel had declared it a ranch holiday, which meant no formal work and everyone who wanted to could come and go as they pleased. And the ranch had the loose, easy quality of a place giving itself permission to breathe. Eli, at 15, was home from the school in Austin where he had been sent the previous year on the strength of his correspondence work and Maggie's tireless advocacy with the admissions board. And he was taller now, beginning to carry himself with the particular new gravity of a boy becoming a man. But he was also deeply glad to be home, and it showed in the way he sat on the porch steps with his boots off and his face turned toward the sun. Thomas, 13, was out near the creek with his nature journal and a new ambition to document every species of plant within a mile of the ranch house, a project he pursued with the same wholehearted dedication with which he pursued everything. James, 4, was on Abel's back, wrapped around his father's neck like a particularly cheerful burr, narrating everything he saw with loud authority. William, 1 year old, was in Maggie's arms on the porch, wide awake and considering the world with huge dark eyes that missed nothing, which was already his defining characteristic. Maggie sat in the rocking chair on the porch with the baby, and Abel came up the porch steps with James still attached to his back and sat on the top step beside her chair, and James eventually let go and went to investigate something in the yard, and for a few minutes they just sat in the October light with the baby between them and the sounds of the ranch all around and the enormous Texas sky overhead. "Maggie," Abel said. She looked at him. He was looking at James, who had found a stick and was using it with enormous purpose on something only he could see. He was looking at his son with the fullness of a man who knows exactly what he has and is not taking any of it for granted. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it cost you to come here." "Nothing I was not willing to spend," she said immediately. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know it was not easy, being the hired teacher and alone in a new place and not knowing what you were coming into, and I was not easy. I know what I was like when you arrived, closed off, shut down, about as welcoming as a rock." He paused. "You did not leave. When it would have been reasonable to, you stayed. And you taught my boys and you put up with me, and you built something here that I didn't know how to build on my own." Maggie was quiet, listening. "I keep thinking," he said, "about the lesson you say you were hired to teach, reading, arithmetic, history, all of that." He looked at her now. "But what you actually taught me, I mean, was not anything in any of your primers." "What did I teach you?" she said softly. He thought about it with characteristic care. "That grief is not the same as being finished," he said. "That a man can hold what he's lost and still reach for what's ahead. That." He pressed his mouth together for a moment. "That letting someone in is not a loss of anything. It's a gain. I thought it was the opposite. I thought letting anyone close again meant risking the same wreckage, and that the only protection was to keep everything at arm's length." He shook his head. "I was wrong. You showed me I was wrong, without ever telling me I was wrong, which I think is the mark of a very good teacher." Maggie looked at him for a long, full moment. William made a soft sound in her arms and she shifted him gently, and the baby settled and looked up at her with those serious dark eyes. "My father used to say," she said, "that the best lessons are the ones you learn without knowing you are learning them. The ones that just become part of you and you look back one day and realize you are different than you were, and it's good." "He was wise," Abel said. "He was," she agreed. "He would have liked you very much." Abel reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair, and she turned her palm up and held on, and they sat like that in the October light with their children scattered across the yard and the ranch, and the land stretching out around them vast and golden and fully theirs. And there was between them that particular peace that is the reward of having come through something hard, and found on the other side not ruin, but more life than you expected. Eli came up onto the porch after a while and sat on the other step and looked out at the yard, and after a moment he said, Thomas is going to need someone to help him carry all those plants back." "Then you should go help him," Abel said. "I just sat down," Eli said. "You are 15, Abel said. "Your legs are new." Eli rolled his eyes with the magnificent expressiveness of a teenager being reasonable with unreasonable people, and he stood and went, and they heard him calling out to Thomas somewhere past the fence line, and then Thomas's answering shout, and James looked up from his stick project and decided that wherever his brothers were going was better than where he was, and he trotted off in their direction with his little boots raising small puffs of dust. Abel and Maggie were left alone on the porch with William, who had fallen asleep in the warm curve of her arms, and the ranch spread out before them in the afternoon gold, and the horses in the pasture standing still with their heads down in that peaceful way of horses when nothing is required of them, and the windmill turning slow and steady in the easy wind. "This is a good life," Maggie said. "It is," Abel agreed. "Better than I knew how to ask for." She leaned her head against the side of his shoulder, the baby between them, and he stayed very still the way a man stays still when something good has landed near him, and he does not want to disturb it. The Harlow School grew as the years went on, as Maggie had worked for it to do. By 1890, it had 2 rooms and 2 teachers, and the school board had agreed to her proposal for a library modest, but real. With 112 books donated through a campaign she ran through every church and civic organization in the county. She was not the teacher there herself. She had her own classroom in the main room of the Copper Creek Ranch house, and her own students, her sons, and occasionally the children of the neighboring ranch families who came for special lessons. But she was the force behind it, and everyone in Harlow knew it. The changes in the territory in those years were real and consequential. The open range that had defined the Wild West was being carved up by barbed wire and homestead claims, and the cattle drives that had been the economic lifeblood of men like Abel were giving way to rail shipments that were faster and more reliable. Abel adapted to these changes with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything, converting the ranch's operation and investing in the rail relationships he had cultivated from the beginning. The Copper Creek Ranch entered the 1890s as one of the more solvent operations in that part of Texas, and Abel credited this largely to the fact that he had not been too proud to listen to good counsel, Maggie's counsel, and the counsel of men like Dewey who knew the land. Dewey, at some point in the early 1890s, he was vague about his age and had always been, claiming that counting years was a habit of men who had nothing better to do, retired from active ranch work, and moved into a small room off the kitchen that had always been nominally a storage room, but which was now, by universal agreement, Dewey's room, where he sat by the kitchen fire and told stories and minded the smaller boys, and was treated with the respect due to a man who had been loyal when loyalty was all anyone had to offer. Eli went to the college in Austin at 17 and came back at 21 with a degree in law, which Abel received with the careful pride of a man who does not make a fuss about things that matter enormously to him. He read law in a firm in San Antonio for 2 years and then came home to Harlow, where he opened a small practice and became, within a decade, the most respected lawyer in the county, known for his precise thinking and his refusal to take cases he thought were wrong, which were both directly attributable to a childhood spent in rooms where honest argument was encouraged. Thomas did not go to college immediately. At 18, he went west to New Mexico with a geological survey team and spent 2 years documenting plant and animal life in that territory, sending home letters of such vivid specificity and genuine scientific rigor that Maggie read them aloud at the supper table to increasing wonder. He came back at 20 and went to the University of Texas, and eventually became a naturalist and professor who published 3 books, the first of which, a study of the flora and fauna of the Texas Hill Country. He dedicated to Maggie Redmond Hale, with a note that read, in part, who taught me to look carefully and record honestly and take seriously the things the world shows you when you are patient enough to see them. James grew up on the ranch with both his parents' best qualities: his mother's curiosity and verbal facility, his father's physical steadiness and practical intelligence, and at 14 began to show a gift for the management of the ranch operation that Abel recognized and quietly began to cultivate. He was the son who would keep the Copper Creek going, and both Abel and Maggie understood this without it ever needing to be said. William, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a musician. He had shown an interest in the piano at the Methodist Church in Harlow from the time he was 4 years old, and Maggie had arranged lessons with a traveling teacher who came through the county once a month. And by the time William was 10, it was clear that this was not a passing interest but a genuine gift. Abel, without comment, arranged for a piano to be brought from San Antonio on the rail, a significant expense, and one he would have dismissed as impractical in an earlier version of himself. And William filled the ranch house with music for the rest of the years that music was needed in it. On an autumn evening in 1895, when the ranch was full and the supper table had been extended to accommodate Eli's new wife, a sharp-eyed, warm-hearted woman from Austin named Rosalind, who gave Eli as good as she got, and whom Maggie loved immediately, and Thomas, home between expeditions, and James and William and Dewey, and the various small children that the next generation was beginning to produce, Abel stood up at the head of the table and said that he wanted to say something. The table went quiet with the good-natured attention of people who know that a quiet man saying he wants to speak is saying something important. 13 years ago, Abel said, looking down the length of the table, I put out a notice for a schoolteacher because my boys needed teaching and I did not know how to give them what they needed. He paused. The teacher who answered that notice was better than I deserved and more than I expected, and she taught my sons everything I hoped she would, and a good many things I had not thought to hope for. He looked at Maggie, who was at the other end of the table with William beside her, and his voice, always low, went lower still. And she taught me the most important thing I have learned in my life, which is that a man who has been through grief is not finished. That the heart does not run out, that there is more room in a life than fear allows you to see. The table was very still. I do not say enough, Abel said. That is a known fact about me. But I want to say tonight, in front of everyone at this table, that I am grateful beyond anything I can properly put into words for the woman who came here with a trunk full of books and a determination to do what needed doing. He raised his glass water because Abel Hale did not drink spirits, which was one of the things Dewey always maintained made him a genuinely remarkable man. To Maggie, he said. The table echoed it: Eli, Thomas, James, William, Rosalind, Dewey. The hands who had been invited in for the occasion, and Maggie sat at the other end of the table with her eyes bright and her composure only barely intact, and she raised her own glass in return and said, "To all of you, every single one." Later, when the supper was done and the younger children were in bed and Eli and Rosalind had gone to the room they used when they visited and Thomas was out on the porch with his notebook and James, and William had gone to the barn on some errand of their own, Maggie and Abel sat by the fire in the parlor the way they had sat on a snowy night 13 years ago. And the fire was the same fire and the room was the same room, and they were not the same people, but they were better ones. You did not need to say all of that, she said. I know, he said, but I am very glad you did. He looked at her across the firelight gray-green eyes that were as familiar to her now as her own face in the mirror and as inexhaustible, still capable of surprising her. You have been the making of this place, he said quietly. You have been the making of me. I want you to know that I know it. Maggie Redmond Hale, 40 years old, wife and mother and teacher, and the woman who had stepped off a stage in a small Texas town with a trunk and a stubborn heart, and found more than she came for, looked at the man across the fire, at Abel Hale, 50 years old and graying and still the most careful and deliberate person she had ever known, the man who had been shut and was open, the man who had been afraid and had chosen not to be, the man who had taken her in and let her in and built a life with her that was larger and warmer than either of them could have managed alone. And she felt, as she had felt on an October porch with a sleeping baby in her arms and the Texas land golden and entire around her, the specific and irreplaceable peace of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. "I know you know," she said. "That's one of the things I love best about you." He moved from his chair to the settee where she sat, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and the fire settled in the grate with a soft sound. And outside, the Texas night was enormous and clear, and the stars were where they always were, steady and undiminished. And the Copper Creek Ranch held its people in the way a place holds the lives that have been lived in it, with the particular, indelible warmth of having been loved in. They stayed like that for a long time, the two of them, while the fire burned low and the house settled into its nighttime sounds around them, until Abel said, very softly, that they should get to bed, and Maggie agreed, and they went together down the hall the way they had done every night for 13 years, and the lamp was turned down, and the ranch was quiet, and everything that needed to be was well.